thank you. So I understand you guys have a full day plan, and I think what I'm hoping to do is just provide a little fun way to start, and that's talk a little bit about the national races that we're expecting to see throughout the year. We spent the last 12 months kind of watching the primaries for the presidential gear up, and we're starting to vote. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, and before we get into the weeds of what you're here for today, and I know Sean's going to talk a little bit about the Washington races, he asked me to just give a little overview of what's going on nationally. So with that, what I'd like to do is just kind of give you an overview of what people are thinking in terms of the presidential cycle and cover both sides. Not just the candidates, but more importantly, the process, because the process for how these various primaries play out is really important. We had the Iowa caucus recently, the New Hampshire primary is tonight, which is going to be a big deal, and then we go on to South Carolina next. So over the course of the next really 4 to 6 weeks, there's going to be a lot of news out there as the primary season kicks into high gear. So I want to talk about the process, and then we'll get into the candidates themselves and kind of deconstruct Iowa a little bit for both parties and look ahead. And then, because whoever comes in as the next president has to face a Congress, sometimes hostile, sometimes not, I thought we'd just touch real quick on what we might expect, particularly with the U.S. Senate, where there are a ton of seats in play, and then quickly touch on the House. So that's the agenda. I'm going to try to confine myself to 30 minutes and leave some time for questions, because I know everybody has questions about presidential politics. Let me start with, there's my agenda. Let's start with the presidential campaign, and I'm going to just put a map up here so you can look at it while I talk. One of the things that I really want to describe is the context for the presidential campaign, not just the primaries, but then eventually the general election. It's sort of perceived as a national campaign, but it's really 50 individual campaigns, because every state votes, every state contributes to an electoral college count, and eventually, as the winner, you need 270 votes, electoral college votes, to win. You do not need a majority vote, which we learned in 2000. So one of the things that is really important to look at as you think about presidential politics, presidential campaigns really, they're about persuasion, yes, on some level, but really they're about turning out your base. They're about identifying, energizing, and mobilizing your key political constituencies. That was the theory behind President Bush's 2004 campaign. That was the theory behind President Obama's 2008, 2012 campaigns. It's more expensive to try to persuade a voter to vote for you than it is to identify a voter and get them to the polls. So it's something to think about when you're trying to mobilize your base. The question is, who is your base? And for Republicans, after 2012, they did a lot of navel gazing. You may recall there was a lot of discussion about their inability to attract and convert non-white voters to their candidates. Certainly Mitt Romney struggled there. So there was a lot of discussion about what they do, and it really focused on the realities on the ground. And let me just give you a few statistics that sort of underscore this. In 1998, which was the year George Bush Sr. ran for and won Ronald Reagan's third term, 85% of the electorate nationally was the white vote, 85%. By 2012, that figure was 72%. So over time, that sort of ready coalition that Republicans used to kind of go to and identify and turn out was becoming smaller and smaller in terms of the overall percentage of the electorate. Now that's nationally. But again, as I mentioned, this is not a national election. It's 50 individual elections. So the most important thing is, how are those demographic shifts really upsetting the traditional construct of some of these key target states. So let's look at that. I mentioned 72% by 2012 was the white vote nationally. Drill down in some of the target states: Colorado, Nevada, Virginia, North Carolina, which recall went for Obama in 2008, which was a huge win for a Democrat who had not carried North Carolina for many years, and Florida. All of those states now have less than 70% of their voters considered white voters. So it's going down and down. Let me just talk a little bit more about some of those states specifically. And starting with Florida, you cannot win the presidency without winning Florida. It used to be that you would have, let me see if I've got a little laser here. Oh, I do. So Florida, it used to be, this Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Those are the three big delegates or big electoral college swing states, and you needed 2 out of the 3 of those in order to carry the White House. But Pennsylvania, for all intents and purposes, is really more of a lean Democrat state from a presidential standpoint. No Republican has won it since 1988. So it's a bit of an outdated talking point to say it's part of a map that you need as a Republican. It's really Florida as one of those linchpin states. So in 2000, when Bush happened, Al Gore won 40% of Florida's white vote. And 12 years later, Obama won just 37%. So Obama won less of the white vote than Gore did, but Obama carried it by nearly 75,000 votes. And we all know what happened in 2000 with the recount. So even though Obama's share of the overall white vote went down, he still won the state fairly handily. That's Florida, really important state for Republicans if they want to win the White House. Let's look at Virginia, which for years was considered safe Republican territory at a presidential level, even though they would elect Democrat governors. From a presidential standpoint, it was pretty safe territory. And that's not the case anymore. Obama won Virginia in both 2008 and 2012, but look at their non-white vote. Gore and Obama both won 37% of the white vote in 2000 and 2012, so they won the same percentage. But Obama carried the state 12 years later. Nevada, another big swing state, which is trending with a really high number of Hispanic voters. John Kerry in 2004 and Obama in 2012 both won 43% of the white vote there. Kerry lost the state, Obama won it. So as you can see, just that fact that the white vote not increasing for Democrats is making them even more competitive in some of these swing states that are critical to win the election. So let's, how have Republicans been faring among Hispanics? Because that's a key constituency. When you look at Florida, Virginia, Hispanic vote has increased considerably. Colorado, which is one of the truest swing states out there, and Nevada all have very high numbers of Hispanic voters. George Bush in 2004 won 40% of the Hispanic vote, the most ever. And just to kind of put that in context, that's the share of the white vote that Obama got nationally, 40%. So that's a pretty good achievement for a Republican to win 40% of the Hispanic vote nationally, and it's critical in some of these swing states. But it's diminished over time. McCain in 2008, many people thought because of the leadership role he played in immigration reform in the U.S. Senate that he would fare as well, if not better, than Bush did in 2004, but it went down 31%. I think that was large part due to the fact that Obama was just such a transcendent candidate in 2008, and there were so many people that were motivated behind him that it just diminished McCain's performance there, but there's no question that it went down. And then Romney in 2012 was just abysmal. It continued to drop. It was 27% nationally, and you can't win nationally with that kind of performance among a key constituency like that. So The non-white vote is critical. The Democrats have an expanding base there. They have an expanding base of millennials, which is now the largest generation out there. They surpassed the baby boomers. Sorry, baby boomers in the audience, but you're no longer number one. Last year, they became the largest voting population out there by generation. And that's going to be a big factor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So when you're talking about turning out a base as part of a presidential campaign, Democrats' job is getting easier, Republicans is getting harder. Why is it important for Republicans to kind of do something about this? They had a big report that they conducted and analyzed all the analysis from 2012. It's because of what I just said. They need to turn out a base that will lead to 270 electoral votes, and it's getting harder and harder. Donald Trump right now has an 81% unfavorability rating among Hispanics nationally in the U.S. So if that's somebody that Republicans carry into the general election, it's going to be a challenge when you get into some of these states. So that's a little bit of context for what the two parties are facing as they look at how they put together 270 votes nationally. But let's talk a little bit about the Republicans for now. And I want to focus on the process, because I mentioned that the process is important here and how the primary. Can I keep going and we'll get to questions?
I just want to point out, I don't think that this is an exclusively Republican audience.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to get to both parties. So from a Republican process standpoint, and this is true of both parties, if you look at Iowa and you look at New Hampshire, both of those states are overwhelmingly white. Iowa in particular tends to be more conservative. And so both parties attempted to kind of get some geographic and demographic diversity into the early primary season. So they both agreed to not just do Iowa and New Hampshire, but also add South Carolina and Nevada. So both parties will have 4 primaries in the month of February. And they sort of touch on different regions. They'll touch on different demographics. Obviously, when you get to South Carolina, the African American vote becomes much more important than in Iowa and New Hampshire. So that's a big deal from a process standpoint. But the other thing is, how fast do you get to the nomination? This was something that Republicans sort of looked back in 2012 and said, well, it really took too long for us to nominate Mitt Romney. He wasn't nominated until the end of August. And in the case of McCain, they thought that he was nominated too early. He actually essentially won enough delegates by early March and then had to wait until the late summer to officially receive the nomination. So there's always this conversation among both parties. How soon do you have the nomination process in terms of the actual primary elections? And then when do you nominate your nominee? And so what Republicans have sought to do is compress the schedule and get the nominee to do 2 things: to try to speed things along through the primary process, but also get to the nominee earlier. The biggest reason for that is when you are a primary candidate, you have to spend your own money. So whether you're Hillary Clinton, the sort of potential Democrat nominee, or whoever the Republican decides to nominate, you're spending your own money until you get to the convention. When you get to the convention, the party can spend money on your behalf. So it's a huge advantage to get through the process and get somebody nominated. So what they decided to do is have a more front-loaded primary. We're going to see over the course of the next 6 weeks, most of the states will have a primary election. So by March 15th, when we have the next, there's a series of primary elections that will occur. March 1st will be Super Tuesday. March 15th will be another big time. We should have a pretty good sense on both sides who's going to be the nominee. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Republican side, Jeb Bush, who is obviously the former governor of Florida, had lobbied to have Florida be a winner-take-all state. So if you win the primary election in Florida, you get all the delegates. That didn't used to be the case. He did that before Marco Rubio got in the race. So if he does happen to stay in that long and win, he's going to get a lot of delegates. So you can see, and John Kasich, governor of Ohio, did the same thing in Ohio. That's a winner-take-all primary this year. So you can see there's some things that are set up for candidates like a Jeb Bush or a John Kasich to keep them in a little bit longer, and it could have a major impact. So I want to analyze a little bit of the Ohio results, and I'm going to keep with the Republicans before we get to the Democrats. So a few things here in Iowa to point out as we go into New Hampshire tonight. Obviously, as was stated in the press, the biggest mover was Marco Rubio. If you look at the Des Moines Register poll in Iowa, which is kind of the gold standard for polling for the Iowa caucuses, the last 3 weeks, so the poll 3 weeks out to election night, he moved 12 points. You didn't see that kind of movement with Trump. He actually shrank, and Cruz expanded slightly over the last poll, which was in large part due to two things. One, Cruz had a superior get-out-the-vote effort, which is hugely important in Iowa as a caucus state. Does anybody know the difference between a caucus and a primary? Yeah.
Yeah, so a caucus is like we're going to have here in Washington. You get together in a room with a bunch of people and you select a delegate who will then go to the state convention and vote for the state representatives to the national convention. Primary is you just vote. There's two ways it's set up. One is like the Florida method, winner take all, you vote for the candidate and then he picks the slate of the candidates. In some states, I believe you can still vote for an individual delegate and then who's locked in for the first vote to the candidate that
Right.
the campaign is.
Right. Biggest difference is caucuses are run by the parties, primaries are run by the state. So in Iowa caucus, you tend to have people who are more party activists, and you just can't show up and vote. You have to go, show up, sit through some party business, it probably takes an hour, and then you cast your vote. So it's a real commitment. And that manifests itself in what you see in terms of who shows up. You know, they do entrance polls in Iowa. A lot of times they have exit polls from people who are leaving the polls. Well, in Iowa, they do entrance polls. They grab you when you're on your way into a caucus and ask you a bunch of questions. And 64% of the people who were walking into Republican caucuses self-identified evangelical. Huge number, the most ever. That worked to Cruz's advantage. They also asked people a series of questions. Here's a question that I thought was interesting. The first was, is the candidate you're going to vote for, is it because they share your values? Is it because they tell it like it is, they can bring needed change, or that they can win in November? Those are kind of four different sort of buckets of people. 42%, so a big plurality, said shares my values. There was a very values-based, and this is traditional of Iowa, all of that worked to Cruz's advantage. But it was Rubio at the end of the day who went from 12 points down 3 weeks out to finish at 23, 1 point behind Donald Trump, which is why he sort of got a little bit of a bump coming out of Iowa. There's a question about, you know, people who are new to politics in Iowa, people who are newly registered, and that those were all Donald Trump voters. And it turns out that a good chunk of them were, but only 30%. So the people who actually had never been involved in an Iowa caucus before, maybe hadn't even registered before, those were considered to be sort of Donald Trump's bread and butter. But 70% of them were showing up voting for somebody else. So that's considerable. And as you know, the Rubio momentum narrative was that he was catching momentum, and indeed, 30% of the people who voted, you know, who sort of made up their mind in the last week voted for Rubio, so that showed up as well. And the last thing I would talk about with Republicans is just the question of energy. And this gets back to mobilizing your base, where Democrats have a much better advantage nationally. You need energy. You need energy in the electorate. You need your people to be excited. This was the big benefit of Obama's 2008 campaign, was there was just an enormous amount of energy. In fact, in 2008 in Iowa, there were 220,000 people who cast votes in the Democrat caucus in Iowa in 2008, which was record-breaking. That dipped this year with Obama not in the race and it being between Clinton and Bernie Sanders. On the Republican side, it's actually increasing. They had 189,000 people vote in the Iowa caucuses this year, which is the most the Republicans have ever had. So if you contrast those sort of 2008 and 2016, there's some suggestion that there's more energy on the Republican side than the Democrat side, but I think we're going to have to find that out as more states begin to vote. So let's talk a little bit about the Democrat field. And this is going to be an interesting one to watch. Bernie Sanders. So if you look at the composition of the Democrat electorates in various states, the most white and liberal in the Democrat caucuses are Iowa, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So he's from Vermont. They're having the Iowa caucus, and now they're going to have the New Hampshire primary. Those are sort of his bread and butter states if you look at the composition of the Democrat primary voters there. Once you go to South Carolina and Nevada, it gets a lot different. So we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things I mentioned was just energy, and this is something to watch in New Hampshire for Democrats and in South Carolina and Nevada as we vote later this month. Again, they had 220,000 voters vote in the 2008 caucuses, and that was down to 177,000 this year. So pretty significant drop-off, and the question is that an energy problem? Bernie Sanders really overwhelmingly won the 18 to 29-year-old vote. Again, if you're looking at what are the bases that you motivate, and one being the non-white vote, the other being young voters for Democrats, Barack Obama in 2008 won 28,000 votes from those 18 to 29-year-olds in 2008. Hillary Clinton won 4,000 this year. So they all went to Bernie Sanders for the most part. And that's something that she's going to have to identify and try to rectify going forward. But it is also a question when we get to the general election, assuming she gets the nomination, can she mobilize and really energize the youth vote the way that Barack Obama did, and the way that Bernie Sanders is now mobilizing them? So New Hampshire is a place that tends to rewrite scripts. We've seen this time and again. Hillary Clinton was down 8 points to Barack Obama in 2008, coming out of Iowa and going into New Hampshire, and she won by 2. So she made up 10 points in that state. She's down considerably to Bernie Sanders right now, but maybe that's too much for her to make up, but there's a real firewall for her as you get out of New Hampshire and you get into the next states that are going to vote. Primarily South Carolina, where she holds a huge advantage among African-American voters, something like 74 to 14. And then, of course, to Nevada, which is a much different Democrat primary electorate, where she should perform better. And then if you get into Super Tuesday, which is on March 1st, you've got states like Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Arkansas, Virginia. Again, high numbers of African-American voters. Key constituency for winning the Democrat primary, and she should perform well there. So coming out of New Hampshire, I think the big question for both parties, for Sanders it will be, can he translate some of this early success in Iowa and in New Hampshire and with the national polls into actual wins on the ground in some of these other states as they begin to go through these other states. And then on the Republican side, It's sort of a three-way race right now with Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. But New Hampshire is likely going to deliver some other candidate some sort of win, quote unquote. Like a Kasich, like a Christie, like a Jeb Bush. The Bushes always run well in New Hampshire. If one of them could finish second or third, I think that is a huge win going into some of the states going forward. That should help them. The other thing that's different this cycle than in past cycles is the super PACs, which were kind of in their infancy in 08 and 2012 in particular. But now everybody's got one. So in fact, Jeb Bush still has something like $50 million in his super PAC. It hasn't helped him much because he's already spent $50 million and his numbers have gone down nationally. But nevertheless, it's money that some people will be able to spend on his behalf in some of these other states. And again, I point out that Florida is a winner-take-all state. If he wins that, gives him a lot of delegates. You could easily see several candidates staying in the race well into April, if not May. So just a little bit of where we are in some of the presidential races. I'm going to touch briefly on the Senate and the House, and then just go to questions. But I think it's important because people tend to overlook the importance of Congress as they sort of fixate on the big issue, which is the presidential, and for all the right reasons. I mean, having power over the executive branch in today's world is hugely important and key for both parties. But if you look at the Senate, the one thing that we have is a lot of Republicans who won in 2010 up for re-election. They were elected in 2010, which was a wave Republican year, but they're facing re-election in 2016, which is a much different dynamic. It's a presidential race. It's one where the turnout's going to be bigger. There's going to be younger votes that are in a bigger proportion than in 2010, which was an older, more conservative electorate. And that's not going to bode well for them. And you've got candidates like Russ Feingold up in Wisconsin, who is an exceptional candidate, previous United States Senator, who's facing a Republican who was just sort of elected out of nowhere in 2010 and is already running behind in the polls. So that's one where a lot of national observers are looking at that going, that's one that could easily flip and go Democrat. So in 2014, there were 15 seats that Republicans were defending. You know, there's 100 seats in the United States Senate, and typically a third of them are up every 2 years. They just sort of alternate. So, roughly 33 or so. In 2014, the Republicans defended 15 seats, Democrats defended 21. So Democrats were defending a lot more turf than they were actually playing offense. This year it's totally flipped. Republicans are defending 24 seats and Democrats are only defending 10. And those 24 seats are, in a lot of cases, in states where, they're real swing states or they lean Democrat. Pennsylvania is a great example. Pat Toomey, fairly conservative Republican, was elected in 2010 with just a little over 50%. So that was a midterm election, different electorate, lower turnout. Now he's facing a presidential electorate, which will be bigger and younger and more mobilized from the Democrat side. That's going to be an important one to watch. Florida is an open Senate seat vacated by Rubio. Both parties there will pour a gajillion dollars into that one. Nevada, with Senator Harry Reid retiring, is going to be another one. Nevada's a swing state. And he only won with 50.2% last time around. And I would say New Hampshire, where Kelly Ayotte is a freshman Republican senator taking on the current sitting governor, Democrat in New Hampshire, really high quality candidate. That's one that Republicans could easily see themselves being defeated. So, they have got to hold on to 4 or 5 seats, or I should say Democrats need to flip 4 or 5 seats in order to win, control the Senate. And you can easily see sort of a roadmap there, depending on who the Republicans nominate, which is going to have a major impact down ballot, almost always does, and who the Democrats nominate, because that too will have an impact on their ability to mobilize voters. So quickly on the House, the House of Representatives has sort of become generally a place where incumbents get elected. It's always been that way. But there are fewer and fewer seats that are truly competitive. And because the House swings back and forth every 2 years, they are subject to those big electoral movements. You've seen Democrats elect huge majorities in 2006 and 2008 with the pushback against Bush's second term in 2006, and then with the Obama wave in 2008. You've seen that come back with Republicans in 2010 and 2014. So are we due for another correction the other way? There are only about 12 to 14 seats nationally that you would really consider toss-ups, and Democrats need to win 30 in order to retake control over the chamber. So most people say, it's probably too much to see the Democrats actually picking up that many seats to retake the House. More likely that they retake the Senate, but they'll probably narrow the margin, and we could very well have a Democrat Senate and Republican House greeting the next president of the United States, who may not want that job. So I'm going to just stop there because that was about 25 or 30 minutes, and I know typically people have a lot of questions. I'm happy to entertain any and all of them.